What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a look at Indika, a narrative game that puts you in the role of a young nun known as Indika on a journey of self-discovery in 19th century Russia. And as with all narrative games, it is heavily focused on its story, and there's really not much else to the title. So while I do review games after 100% all the time, I have to forego my normal formula for this one, as this particular type of game doesn't fit that format super well. So we've got to mix it up a tiny bit, which is especially noteworthy for Indika because this is a very short title. It's about 5 to 6 hours depending on you and how long you spend with a few of the puzzles, and thus 100% on this game is a very simple affair that was managed in a single day despite not getting a review copy, which is why you're getting this review only a day after the game itself released. Now before we jump fully into this, it's important that I mention that as a narrative game, it's very difficult to talk about something like this without spoiling something, even contextually in the background footage, and thus if that's really important to you, you might want to go ahead and skip ahead to the conclusion section of the video, as basically everything I'm about to mention forms a substantial portion of the game as it is quite a small title. Nonetheless, however, Indika, as I mentioned, puts us in the role of Indika, who is tasked by her convent to deliver a letter to a monastery some ways away, with the catch of sorts being that Indika does not really fit in with her fellow sisters, not least of which because she hears many voices and is clearly struggling with some mental health problems. And our job in this adventure is to guide her along the way, solve some puzzles, and interact with those voices, which primarily take the form of the devil themselves, accompanying us on this very bizarre journey. Now, before we dive into the rest of this, let's talk about the technical state of this game. Now, bugs-wise, I did not personally really run into much, mainly just some stuttering that is very common with games made in Unreal Engine, and browsing through other people's reports of this title, I have not seen anything that would indicate widespread problems of any sort, so other than that stuttering, the game seems to be in a pretty good place technically speaking, though the stutters themselves are quite annoying. But with that stuff said, let's talk a little bit about the story setup and my thoughts on it. So, like I've already mentioned, Indika, our nun, isn't fitting in well. She's seeing all sorts of things, hearing voices, having doubts, and it's heavily implied that she didn't necessarily want to be a nun, but was rather forced into this situation due to something about her past. After an incident when she was receiving communion, she is tasked with delivering a letter to a nearby monastery. In service of the attempt to deliver this letter, she comes in contact with an escaped convict in a nearby village who takes her hostage after saving her only moments before. This ex-con, Ilya, claims to himself be hearing the voice of God, and they become sort of unlikely traveling companions along this journey, bouncing all sorts of philosophy off each other as they move through this harsh, bleak environment, learning about themselves as they go. Now that's about as much as I want to mention in terms of the story directly, so as not to spoil as much as possible here, but there are a few things that I think are noteworthy and worth mentioning. For starters, the game does feature a little bit of nudity and some pretty heavy mature themes, which might not be for everybody, but otherwise I thought the story was quite good, as it better be for a narrative game, basically, as it is the game. And one thing I really want to hone in on specifically in relation to that is how some of the mechanics and puzzles and things really lean into Indika's bizarre take on the world. For instance, as you start moving through places, you'll notice over the course of the game that things get more preposterous in their sizing. You'll see things that are just gigantic when they probably shouldn't be. Later in the game, you even start seeing things outright, and it becomes clear over time that what you're seeing isn't exactly reality, but rather a worldview through the eyes of this nun. Another aspect of this is the point system. Now, Indika doesn't really feature progression systems or anything like that, but as you engage with the world, find certain objects, complete a few tasks, your character will earn points. These are useless, they don't do anything at all, and the game itself will in fact tell you this, and this is kind of the point, because Indika sees gathering these things as a sort of spiritual labor that she's going through to make up for the mistakes of her past. Those mistakes of her past, or her past in general, is explored through flashbacks in the form of like these pixelated games that, if you're paying attention, will ultimately explain how she became a nun, why she feels the way she does about certain things, etc. And they do a great job of characterizing her as a person beyond just her more immediate troubles. And when the end of the game rolls around, It's very much so open to interpretation about what we or our character here learned or found out about themselves, but I personally thought it was a really well done ending that really helped clarify that what you've been seeing up to this point is the world through Indika's eyes and how she has framed her worldview based upon the things she has experienced and learned throughout her life. From there, though, let's talk about some of the gameplay elements you can expect with this particular title. Now, in many ways, this is essentially a walking simulator, but there are some important things to note. One, there are absolutely areas of the game where you can die, but this just sets you back to a checkpoint from a moment ago, so it's not really any great loss, and you're free to attempt things as you please. Otherwise, we're simply exploring and solving puzzles. This can come in more minor forms, like say finding a specific item in the environment to then interact with and move forward somehow, or more specific puzzles, like say carefully setting things up so you can navigate the world appropriately by moving objects or boxes around so you can climb. Though, one of the more interesting puzzles is that of, I guess, just praying puzzles for lack of a better term for them. Occasionally there are parts of the game where the area you're in will suddenly glow this bright red, and in order to get that to stop, thus shifting the world a little bit and how you navigate it, is by having Indika pray. And doing this will sort of snap the world back to reality, connecting the fractured environment and allowing you to pass certain obstacles. And then, still other times, it's more about not getting hit by giant fish knocking you into a furnace. And that is still further juxtaposed against smaller little puzzles that will put you in those pixel levels that I mentioned that see you platforming and moving across them in a sort of throwback to older platformers. But all of those things put together, I like how they reflect what our character is going through as we move through these environments, down to subtle details about things getting larger and more skewed as you go, the things you're seeing, and even the puzzles themselves interacting with our worldview and progress forward, as it were. So because of those things, I think both the gameplay and the story itself here definitely have some things to say, but also leaves them open to interpretation a bit. And before we start wrapping this up, I want to mention the Steam Deck. This particular title is playable on the Steam Deck, but I find that it struggles to get a decent frame rate. Luckily, the game itself is relatively simple in design, so gameplay-wise, there's not really much to know, but the game struggles to hover around, I would say, 20 FPS, and unfortunately, there's just not a lot of graphical options or things like that to tweak or affect at all. So while you can play this on the Steam Deck, I wouldn't really call it a great experience either. Which brings me to the end portion of this particular video. So whereas normally I would go over things like positives and negatives, as this particular game is such a small title, this is mostly just going to be pure conclusion on my part, and to that end, I would say Indika succeeds at the thing it is trying to do mainly, which is simply tell you a compelling story, which is important because as a narrative game, the game is the story. I especially like how they told that story through the eyes of this one specific person and how they see the world, which means you have to take everything you're actually interacting with alongside a grain of salt, as what we're seeing is filtered through a very specific worldview that the game does a great job of blending in with even its regular old puzzle mechanics, both in the form of its flashbacks to the pixelized portions or the puzzles that are directly affected by, say, praying and trying to affect the environment by doing so. And in those ways, Indika is very memorable and certainly unique. I doubt I'll forget anything this game was doing anytime soon, but the main thing to keep in mind when it comes to Indika for yourself is simply that it's a very odd title in a very niche genre, and combined with its very heavy themes centered around religion, trauma, a bleak and desolate world, it's safe to say that this game will very much so not be for everybody, but the thing it is trying to do, it does very, very well. And if that sounds like something you would enjoy, then I think Indika is definitely worth taking a look at. Now, conclusion-wise, I do think that butts up against one other problem, which is that for what this game is and how long it runs, it's a bit on the expensive side, with it being $25 US full price. I think they're going to have a hard time moving a ton of copies of this at that particular price point. Personally, I would have preferred to see this around $10 or $15, but it is what it is. I paid the $22.49 with a launch discount, and it was a compelling enough story that I feel fine with that, so I'm comfortable giving this game a buy. But that's with the understanding that these types of games aren't for everybody and they're more of an experience than anything else. That said, personally, I do love a good narrative title, and thus here I am reviewing the thing. So that is pretty much going to do it for my coverage of Indika. A very bizarre title, I would say one of the more bizarre games out there that I've played, but I thoroughly enjoyed my time with it, and if you're after a compelling narrative, this might just foot that bill for you. Which is where I'm going to wrap this up. So I certainly hope you enjoyed the video, hope you enjoyed the look at this game. If you did, feel free to let me know down below how you feel about it. Which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.